Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Spectre here on the 5x5 network. Time for a little fireside chat. Saturday night, weekend, fire's hot. Extra couple logs or two on the old fire here. Staying warm in the middle part of deplorable country. Good to have you aboard, and if you're on the YouTube side, welcome back. This is our first broadcast back. Hello, Susan. Good to see you again. We are not gone. Ha ha ha. Any case, good to have you aboard. Would recommend that you get over on the Twitches, the D-Lives, and of course tonight we are also broadcasting over on pill.net, aka also the Foxhole app. Good to see you. Looks like we got a few of you guys hanging out over there. See if I can get chat brought up here as well. There we go. So I'll be trying to monitor chat throughout the evening as well as my combined chat off of everything else. Try and have a crooked neck and watch all directions, I guess, here this evening. So good to have you aboard. Tonight on the broadcast, I got a few things that I want to try and cover here. Talk a little bit about censorship and what it means to be an American, where we stand in that regard, a little bit on the finance side. So sit back, relax, as usual. If you're not accustomed to the old firesides, just kind of a relaxing evening. Sitting by the fire, grab your beverage of choice, coffee, hot cocoa, hot toddy, a little rum, whatever your fancy is. And we'll get after it here momentarily. And if you're joining from Texas, hopefully you guys are staying warm. You guys are recovering down there after this last week's bout. You guys definitely in the prayers for what's going on there. And now been talking about Texas for a little over a week. May come back and do another piece on that tomorrow before our roundtable on Sunday, much like I did last Sunday. So there's some developments regarding what's been going on there. So stay tuned on that. We may do that before our roundtable tomorrow. So that being said, let's get into it here this evening. All right. So first up tonight, I got an opinion piece out of WayneDupree.com. It says, opinion, I can't speak for everyone else, but I am remaining American to the core. Alright, and some of you guys on D-Live, perhaps you follow Wayne Dupree. I do periodically jump in and listen to his broadcast. Definitely a conservative. My guess you'll probably see him at CPAC here. I can't say for certain, but definitely one of the good guys, a vet. Let's see, now that I have vented, I still have hope, but it is getting harder and harder to sustain. It says, this article contains commentary which reflects the author's opinion. Alright, so America won't be healed any more than the Soviet Union was. The Democracies and Republicrats hate the majority of us far more than the Politburo ever hated its proles. Much more than 75 million Americans voted for President Trump, as you know. That's only the amount of votes he was left with after the Democracies stole the rest and added at least 20 million to Dementia Joe. America will collapse as the USSR did, but who can predict in what way? Even if it keeps a name in all 50 states, it won't be America. It's been a month since the inauguration, and the military occupies the Capitol. At the same time, Congress plots with the administration to purge dissidents with show trials, re-education, loss of livelihood, property loss, and flat-out prison time. The slogan of quote-unquote unity really means obedience to the dirtbagocrat party and complete acceptance of their coup. What is a fact, and must be stated and accepted, is that there are two nations and two peoples within the United States borders. One is based on individual freedom and limited government, the principles of the founders. The other is Marxist and totalitarian and despises the founders' ideas. There is no getting around it. there are only a few ways forward. One is acquiescence and submission by the right, a group not prone to militancy. Another is a massive Christian revival. But given that much of Western Christendom's hierarchy has been captured by the left, that is highly unlikely. Certainly within the time needed to prevent the other paths. Another scenario is a retaking of the federal government by the GOP. Given the weakness of party leaders, many don't even see that we are at war, and the Democrat move to codify corrupt electoral practices. That is also highly unlikely. Could a convention of the states turn the tide? There are not enough states, and worse, not enough time. It is a constitutional process in a post-constitutional time. A split into two nations is what I see as the only way forward. Given that the philosophical split occurs within all states, primarily between urban and rural, I doubt it will be a congenial, nonviolent split. In fact, the left's violence against the right began in earnest last summer, and is now moving from the streets into the workplace and the courts. So, we have big screen TVs, social media, and cars. Those don't make a country, and they sure don't make us free. They're just a more comfortable version of Orwell's Prolifide. We sat back and watched a year of ongoing murderous and destructive terrorism by media back our anarchists and pajama boy crybabies and did nothing. At the same time, the democracies aided and lionized them. We've suffered nearly a year of dirtbagocrat mask mandates and lockdown restrictions without rebellion. We watched real domestic enemies of our country blatantly steal a presidential election and did nothing. And now, the democracies vow to punish dissidents in the same ways totalitarian regimes have always done. And we still do nothing. America, as we used to know it, is done. The beginning of the end, as people used to say, except for this time, it's real. Oh, and did I mention the impending economic ruin? That's inevitable given the policies being imposed by Biden and his lackeys. We could end up in another Great Depression, and the current government doesn't have the capability to alleviate one, much less reverse it. Quite the opposite. Done. Over. For all intents and purposes. And those are all that really matters because the reality of a ruined America trumps dirtbagocrat propaganda. Now that I have vented, I still have hope, but it is getting harder and harder to sustain. Everybody needs a space to vent. Am I right? There are a couple sayings that give hope, but which do not always hold either. One is, it is always darkest before dawn. The other, addicts have to reach bottom before recovery can occur. There are times where dawn is just as dark with emerging darkening storms or blizzards. Then one has to wait quite some time before another dawn appears. Also, not every addict who reaches rock bottom starts on the road to recovery. Some get very sick, and some even die. Most importantly, one thing, we have to remain hopeful, while also acknowledging reality, but doing anything in our power to resist the present tyranny. So that's the opening piece on the night. Good to see you guys out there in chat. Scroll through. Good to see you guys over on the D-Live side, as well as our folks over on YouTube. Good to see you. So what do you make of that? Is he right? Do we see a crack-up taking place in this country? A war of ideologies? Is there any reconciliation that can be had at this point? I think there are likely many who say no. Perhaps why we see movements like Texit, and perhaps movements to break off portions of California as well as southern Oregon into a 51st state, right? This stuff has been talked about for years and years and years. But, again, as somebody who has been through the Federalist Papers, been through the Constitution, been through the Declaration of Independence, Our founders were very, very smart folks, and they laid the groundwork for what we presently have, but also what happens should it ever get to a point where we have to take over and do something about a corrupt government. And one of those things being, and I don't remember which Federalist Papers off the top of my head this was, but basically we do have to make ourselves divisible, very divisible, in that we break things apart to the point where our representatives have to be reelected. We have to create new boundaries and districts in them for them to even consider ruling over us at this point. Make it even larger. There is no rule that says we have to have 435 in the House of Representatives, 100 senators. Nothing in the Constitution that says that. Period. We can craft that to be whatever we want. And so that may be the alternative here. And of course, definitely get more community-minded, obviously. The state isn't going to help you, folks. The government is not going to help you. 9 worst words to hear from the government, as Ronald Reagan says, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, right? So, in any case, that's the opening piece for the evening, kind of setting the stage, as it were. So, some other crazy news. I like to read these periodically. Simon Black out of Sovereign Man had this, and perhaps you've heard this in the last week as well. Chest-feeding people is the new gender-inclusive term in UK hospitals. So it's not that they just want to take over the ideology. They want to control the way you speak, the way you think, the way you do anything, and if you don't, guess what? We'll just cancel you out of culture, and while we're at it, we'll do the same thing as what they've done to Trump, and we'll prevent you from engaging in commerce. Oh, don't take the vaccine? Guess what? Yeah, you don't get to go to sports stadiums, you don't get to take public transportation, you don't get to go in stores. Please continue to wear your mask, don't pass go, don't collect $200, and away we go, right? So, there we go. Alright, so out of Sovereign Man here in the last couple days, says, are you ready for this week's absurdity? Here's our Friday roll-up of the most ridiculous stories from around the world that are threats to your liberty, risks to your prosperity, and on occasion, inspiring poetic justice. So again, starting off with chest-feeding people. Apparently breastfeeding is no longer PC. The new gender-inclusive term in UK hospitals for all you female deniers and male deniers. The Brighton and Sussex University hospitals are part of the UK's National Health Service network. In a recent bulletin, the hospitals lay out their new policy on, quote, gender inclusion language guidance in maternity, end quote. I guess we needed a little help there. We must have been perhaps a little misguided. I digress. It says, for us, a gender additive approach means using gender-neutral language alongside the language of womanhood in order to ensure that everyone is represented and included. Apparently, the term breastfeeding is now offensive, according to our social warlords, and it's even more offensive to refer to a mother who's nursing as a breastfeeding woman, because that terminology is not gender inclusive. So, the hospitals will therefore begin referring to such people as chest-feeding people. The hospital cites precedents set by the British Medical Association, which recognizes that a large majority of people who get pregnant and give birth are women. However, some may be trans men or non-binary people. Therefore, the term pregnant people is more politically correct than expectant mothers. British Medical Association, perhaps you are no longer an institution worthy of listening to. Give it up. Your creds are done, if that's the route you guys go. And as far as the university side, yeah, those institutions also. We'll cast you aside. You no longer have merit to tell us anything. You book studies who have never held a real job, period. In any case, carrying on, getting the right answer in math class is white supremacy. So, just as in the days of 1984, how many fingers am I holding up? 3? No. You're incorrect. 4. 2 plus 2 equals 5, folks. 5. That is the correct answer, or else you're a white supremacist. A recent update from the Oregon Department of Education encourages math teachers to sign up for an online course meant to, quote, dismantle racism in mathematics instruction. The course tells math teachers, for example, that white supremacy culture shows up in math classrooms when the focus is on the right answer. Other white supremacist math practices include tracking students' progress and requiring students to meet academic expectations. So, gone are the days, folks, where you can learn some simple math. No, in today's world it's all about, castigating you into some little stereotype or using identity politics and everything else. Yeah, there you go, folks. 2 plus 2 is no longer 5 because that is just you exercising your white supremacy. You're not woke enough. Carrying on, Google offers black-owned business label to online retailers. So apparently now, if you have to go out to Yelp or any place like that to study said businesses, you now apparently need to know what race of business it is before you patronize it, according to Google. Oh, by the way, didn't Google used to have a mantra that says, don't be evil? Oh, that's right. They took that slogan down a couple years ago, if you remember right. So now, you can assume accordingly. Google now allows black-owned online retailers to add a label which says a business, quote, identifies as black-owned, end quote. However, there does not appear to be any proof required to change your business identity to black-owned. We wonder whether Google will eventually have to start auditing some entrepreneurs' claims, or how they'll set up an adjudication process if someone identifies as black, but consumers dispute the claim. We've not seen that before, have we? In case you're wondering, Google has no labels for businesses owned by trans, non-binary, Native American, disabled, queer, etc. individuals. Give it time, folks. That's coming. Give it time. Insane. And carrying on, singer fined 3,000 euros for singing with his son. Oh yeah, this is really interesting out of Germany. It says a Bavarian court fined a German folk singer 3,000 euros for violating child labor laws. His crime? Allowing his then 4-year-old son to sing a song with him on stage in 2019. The father and son sang "What a Wonderful World" while the rest of the family and audience watched. The German government considered this, quote-unquote, employing the child for the half hour or so he was on stage. If this had occurred between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., no crime would have taken place. But because German law prohibits children from performing after 5 p.m., the 8 p.m. concert violated the child labor law. So, the German government is treating this dad as if he sent his son down into the coal mines. Yup. There you have it. Some of the ridiculousness from around the webosphere. You think some of these governments are getting maybe a little overreaching, perhaps? It's time to put them back inside their box, folks, and establish who we the people are. Not just here in these United States, but around the world. Their power has been unchecked, and it's time for them to realize who really holds the power. And so, off to a little bit of financial news. We get this out of Charles Hugh Smith's Of Two Minds blog. It says, what poisoned America? America's financial system is nothing more than a toxic waste dump of speculation, fraud, collusion, corruption, and rampant profiteering. So mind you, if you paid attention here over the last couple weeks, the Redditors, the folks of Robin Hood, what we just saw here play out with old Mad Max leading the charge out of the House Financial Committee here in recent days with the hearings and that with Citadel and the head of Robin Hood, etc., etc. We got to see it on full display, did we not? Are things not being exposed in rapid succession here as of late? So what poisoned America? The list of suspects is long. Systemic bias, special interests, dominating politics, political polarization, globalization, and the offshoring of productive capacity, overregulation, the rise of rapacious cartels and monopolies, big tech's gulag of the mind, the permanent adolescence of consumerism, permanent global war, just to name a few. The question boils down to this. What problems cannot be addressed by the status quo? Most of the ills listed above can be addressed with existing mechanisms of governance and adaptation. For example, consider systemic bias. The U.S. Armed Forces have demonstrably led the way in dramatically reducing systemic bias via performance-based advancement. The rest of America would do well to copy these organizational improvements. Many of the other ills could be addressed within current systems of governance, antitrust, etc. The two that appear impervious to reform are 1. Soaring wealth, income, power, inequality, and 2. The dominance of special interests. Special interests being the K Street folks in D.C. who buy our politicians. And boy, there used to be a meme that I used to see running around social media that says maybe our politicians need to wear suits like what NASCAR does, showing all their various sponsors. Maybe we need to resurrect that idea and put it on them. Nonetheless, the article continues, says in both cases the corporate foxes are guarding the henhouse. So any reforms with real teeth are watered down to PR by those reaping the vast majority of the financial gains. Corporate profits are in the billions, while you can buy elected officials' cooperation for mere millions. There is no way to get around that asymmetry. I would propose an even deeper systemic poison. Zero interest yield on capital. For a variety of reasons, the yield on capital is either zero or less than zero if we factor in inflation. We now earn 0.1% on your cash, while inflation is somewhere between the quote-unquote official rate of 3% and more real-world measures between 5 and 10%. There is a significant change from the days when savings and loans institutions earned 5.25% by regulation. While ordinary capital earns nothing, or less than zero, the capital and income of the top 0.01% has rocketed to unprecedented levels. This vast asymmetry is poisoning America and the financial system. From the Federal Reserve on down, is incapable of addressing it other than making it even more distorted and destructive by doing more of what's failed spectacularly. To understand why yields on capital have fallen to zero, while wealth income has flowed to the top elites, we need to look at wages' share of the economy and capital's share of the economy. So the wages share, in effect, labor's share, has been falling for the past 45 years, while corporate profits and the wealth of America's top tier has soared. It is not coincidence that as interest rates fell to zero, the wealth and income of the top 0.01% soared, while ordinary wage income fell 10% when adjusted for the purchasing power of the earnings. A recent report prepared by the RAND Corporation, Trends in Income from 1975 to 2018, documents that 50 trillion, that's a T, trillion, in earnings has been transferred to owners and capital from the bottom 90% of American households in the past 45 years. And I'll part from the article here real quick to say this. Think back to what has just happened over the course of 2020. You get all these lockdowns and mandates to shut your businesses. Can't go anywhere without having face diaper on. Everybody starts buying online. How rich did people like Mr. Bezos and his wife become because people continued to buy online? And all the big box stores. You get the idea. What happens when the purchasing power of the earnings of the bottom 90% declines for decades? Even high earners such as doctors have experienced a decline in the purchasing power of their earnings since 1975. Households cannot borrow as much money as they once could because their earnings simply don't go as far. There is less disposable income to support more debt service. What happens when corporate profits skyrocket, as jobs are offshored and corporations arbitrage all the goodies of globalization? The corporations don't need to borrow as much money as they have trillions in profits to work with. And of course, all stored offshore, right? Apple? In other words, demand for credit stagnates, while at the same time the Federal Reserve has flooded the economy with near zero rate credit. Demand has stagnated along with wages, while supply has rocketed into the trillions, thanks to unprecedented central bank credit creation. The reason why central banks have slashed rates to zero is obvious. If the bottom 90% can't borrow more money at 5% to consume more goods and services, they can certainly borrow more at 1.5% because the interest part of their monthly payment drops significantly. And sure enough, crushing rates to near zero has triggered refinancing and housing bubbles and generated high auto truck sales based on a few dollars down and 1.9% auto financing. In other words, as the purchasing power of wages has relentlessly declined, the fix is to substitute debt for earnings. The fact that eventually stagnating earnings cannot support more debt at any rate of interest is inconvenient, so it's being ignored. Zero interest rates has played out differently in corporate America. Since capital is so cheap to borrow, why not borrow a few $billion at 1.5% and use the money to buy back shares of the company's stock, which generates a hefty 10% annual increase in the share price? Indeed, why not? And I digressed from the article to say, oh, and never mind the fancy footwork they do with the balance sheets, right? Talking about EBITDA and things of that nature, and all sorts of shenanigans they play with the financials net since Glass-Steagall was introduced. And why not use that cheap capital to automate tasks to reduce costly American labor and move even more staff overseas to low-wage nations? Indeed, why not? Maximizing profits demands it, and the near-zero cost of capital incentivizes it. Or perhaps, reading that paragraph another way, we'll just exploit the labor of other nations who are less costly, like China or Indonesia or any other southeastern country. Except what happens when they start to demand higher wages? Well, time to offshore to yet another country so we can exploit that labor. The net result of near zero yields on capital? The top 0.1% own more wealth than the bottom 80%. Roughly 75% of all income gains have gone to the top 0.01%. This extreme asymmetry has poisoned American society and its economy. This immense distortion in the cost of capital can be best understood by asking, what happens when a resource is free? The answer is that it's squandered, but the squandering is only part of the problem. Consider what happened when air and water were free. Both the air and water became toxic waste dumps, and American rivers infamously caught on fire. The same is true of free capital. America's financial system is nothing more than a toxic waste dump of extreme speculation, fraud, collusion, corruption, and rampant profiteering. The rivers are on fire, but the Federal Reserve's plan remains the same. Keep the cost of capital at free, so the extremes of speculation can run to failure. The run to failure will be as extreme as the asymmetries that have poisoned America. There you go. Article's got a few charts and graphs, but obviously I'm not sharing that. Bottom line, the graphs highlight the relentless assault on our system. First of which showing the national income, corporate profits before tax, and that hitting up, and up from about 1950 to 2020. Also, the relentless 50-year decline in wages, the share of the economy total income, dating back from, say, the 1970s till now, has been on a steady decline. And of course, average family income, excluding capital gains adjusted for inflation, in terms of 2002 numbers versus 2012, shows that the cream of the crop obviously is going to the 0.01%. Or they own 76.2% of everything versus the bottom remaining folks. And the top 0.1% now own more than the bottom 80%, of course. And that didn't happen until, guess when? We went off the gold standard in Nixon's era. So there you have it. So bottom line, what have we been told? Well, gold destroys the Fed. Not Bitcoin. Granted, you guys can use Bitcoin all you like. It's an asset. I don't see it as a currency. It's still a fiat currency at that. That's your choice. Bottom line, I believe in something that's been around a hell of a lot longer than a digital currency or anything like a CBDC, a central bank digital currency that they look to propose. Gold has always withstood the test of time, always retained its value, much the same as silver. Alright, moving out of some financial news, let's talk about a little poll here. Planet Free Will, Joe Jankowski's got this as poll. Majority of Americans believe increased government power means less individual freedom. Who'da thunk, right? The results of the poll are unsurprising, and in fact a continuation of what appears to be long-standing concern amongst Americans. Oh yeah, if you got an overreaching government who seeks to spy on you, cancel you, and everything else, where did our freedom go, right? So a new poll shows the American public believes that as government grows more powerful, the less free they become. According to a new Just the News daily poll with Scott Rasmussen, 63% of Americans say increasing government's power means individuals will enjoy less freedoms, while only 22% disagree with that proposition. Meanwhile, 15% of those polled were not sure. Well, apparently they're not paying too much attention, I suppose. So in any case, as Just the News reports, the responses by party affiliation were largely as expected, with a higher percentage of Republicans and Democrats expressing concern about the loss of individual freedom. However, some of the responses appeared unexpected. 79% of Republicans said more government means less freedom, but a near majority Democrats, 49%, also had that concern, as did 50% of somewhat liberal respondents. So, when considering that the government growth in the United States is constant, as can be seen with recent calls for expanding terror laws domestically, the Orwellian idea of installing a reality czar and the passage of legislation to form a federal commission to consider racial reparations, the results of the poll are unsurprising, and in fact, a continuation of what appears to be long-standing concern amongst Americans. In 2019, a poll by Harris Poll/Purple Project, which surveyed 2,002 people nationwide, found that 92% of Americans were concerned their rights were being jeopardized. Specifically, Americans were highly concerned with maintaining their freedom of speech, right to bear arms, and ability to receive equal treatment under the law. Now, mind you, that poll was from 2019. So this was as DJT was still president, right? And of course, now that the pendulum has swung the other way, and we got the imposter-in-chief sitting in the Oval Office, you can expect that that number probably would go up even more so, I suppose, if they were to redo the survey now. Freedoms U.S. adults feel are most threatened. Well, the first of which is the freedom of speech with 48%. The right to bear arms, right up there with it, about 47%. The right to equal justice, about 41%. Freedom of expression, about 37%. And freedom of religion rounding out the top 5 at 35% per Statista. Says the Harris Poll/Purple Project results came out 1 week after it was revealed by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education that at least 6.4 million students at nearly 500 campuses in the U.S. have experienced their freedom of speech being restricted, reports Zero Hedge. Also in 2019, Reporters Without Borders dropped the U.S. to number 48 out of 180 on its annual World Press Freedom Index, 3 ranks lower than the previous year. So, reading another way, that means that there are 47 other countries that are more free than us. Aren't we supposed to be the land of the free? Home of the brave? Where is that? Exactly. Never before have U.S. journalists been subjected to so many death threats or turned so often to private security firms for protection, the Press Freedom Watchdog stated. In 2020, Reporters Without Borders ranked the U.S. 45th on their Press Freedom Index, behind countries such as South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan. The optics of a militarized police state in Washington, D.C., and razor fencing around the Capitol building in 2021 also surely isn't helping Americans hold on to the belief they live in the most free country in the world. So I thought that was a rather interesting piece as well. And over the years, yes, we continue to drop on said index and not getting better. And if by chance House Resolution 1, House Resolution 127, and things of that like are going to be passed, we're going to be ruled by executive fiat by the imposter sitting in the Oval Office, then yes, I would say we no longer live in a free country. Let's see. Yes, fire is toasty. Sunny days, it's a good night for a fire, as always. Alright, let's see. Continuing on this evening, got a couple other pieces I want to get to. The Rutherford Institute's got this piece talking about techno-censorship, the slippery slope from censoring disinformation to silencing truth. And that's dating back to the 17th here out of John Whitehead and Nisha Whitehead over at the Rutherford Institute. This also coming out just before it was announced that Zuckerberg and Dorsey and company will be back on the Hill sometime here in March. I did see that here just in the last day or so for more hearings. Kind of a continuation of what they did last fall. So it's going to be interesting to see what plays out there. But obviously, what the government cannot get done, they will just offload to their corporate folks to do for us. Hence why we need to get the hell off of all of these platforms and turning by way of MySpace. So the article starts as, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And that, of course, a quote out of George Orwell's 1984. This is a slippery slope that leads to the end of free speech as we once knew it. In a world increasingly automated and filtered through the lens of artificial intelligence, we are finding ourselves at the mercy of inflexible algorithms that dictate the boundaries of our liberties. And of course, I'll digress real quick to say, if you paid attention over the week, off of Twitter, Paul Sperry just got banned out of Real Clear Politics just this past week. No rhyme, no reason, no nothing, just poof, gone. That's it, done. And that's what a technological gulag does. Once artificial intelligence becomes a fully integrated part of the government bureaucracy, there will be little recourse. We will be subject to the intransigent judgments of techno-rulers. This is how it starts. Martin Niemöller's warning about the widening net that ensnares us all still applies. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. In our case, however, it started with the censors who went after extremists, spouting so-called hate speech, and few spoke out because they were not extremists and didn't want to be shamed for being perceived as politically incorrect. Then the internet censors got involved and went after extremists spouting disinformation about stolen elections, the Holocaust, and Hunter Biden. And few spoke out because they were not extremists and didn't want to be shunned for appearing to disagree with the majority. By the time the techno-censors went after extremists spouting misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccines, the censors had developed a system and strategy for silencing the nonconformists. Still, few spoke out. Eventually, we the people will be the ones in the crosshairs. At some point or another, depending on how the government and its corporate allies define what constitutes extremism, we the people might all be considered guilty of some thought crime or other. When the time comes, there may be no one left to speak out or speak up in our defense. Whatever we tolerate now, whatever we turn a blind eye to, whatever we rationalize when it is inflicted on others, whether in the name of securing racial justice or defending democracy or combating fascism, will eventually come back to imprison us, one and all. Watch and learn. We should all be alarmed when prominent social media voices such as Donald Trump, Alex Jones, David Icke, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. are censored, silenced, and made to disappear from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram for voicing ideas that are deemed politically incorrect, hateful, dangerous, or conspiratorial. The question is not whether the content of their speech was legitimate. The concern is what happens after such prominent targets are muzzled. What happens once the corporate techno-censors turn their sights on the rest of us? It's a slippery slope, from censoring so-called illegitimate ideas to silencing truth. Eventually, as George Orwell predicted, telling the truth will become a revolutionary act. We are on a fast-moving trajectory. Already, there are calls for the Biden administration to appoint a reality czar in order to tackle disinformation, domestic extremism, and the nation's so-called reality crisis. Knowing what we know about the government's tendency to define its own reality and attach its own labels to behavior and speech that challenges its authority, this should be cause for alarm across the entire political spectrum. Here's the point. You don't have to like Trump or any of the others who are being muzzled, nor do you have to agree or even sympathize with their views. But to ignore the long-term ramifications of such censorship would be dangerously naive. As Matt Welch writes for Reason, rightly points out, proposed changes to government policy should always be visualized with the opposing team in charge of implementation. Let me read that again. As Matt Welch, writing for Reason, rightly points out, Proposed changes to government policy should always be visualized with the opposing team in charge of implementation. In other words, whatever powers you allow the government and its corporate operatives to claim now, for the sake of the greater good, or because you like or trust those in charge, will eventually be abused and used against you by tyrants of your own making. As Glenn Greenwald writes for The Intercept, the glaring fallacy that always lies at the heart of pro-censorship sentiments is the gullible, delusional belief that censorship powers will be deployed only to suppress views one dislikes, but never one's own views. Facebook is not some benevolent, kind, compassionate parent or a subversive, radical actor who is going to police our discourse in order to protect the weak and marginalized, or serve as a noble check on mischief by the powerful. They are almost always going to do exactly the opposite. Protect the powerful from those who seek to undermine elite institutions and reject their orthodoxies. Tech giants, like all corporations, are required by law to have one overriding objective: maximizing shareholder value. They are always going to use their power to appease those they perceive wield the greatest political and economic power. Welcome to the age of techno-fascism. Clothed in tyrannical self-righteousness, techno-fascism is powered by technological behemoths, both corporate and governmental, working in tandem to achieve a common goal. Thus far, the tech giants have been able to sidestep the First Amendment by virtue of their non-governmental status, but it's a dubious distinction at best. Certainly, Facebook and Twitter have become the modern-day equivalents of public squares, traditional free speech forums, with the internet itself serving as a public utility. But what does that mean for free speech online? Should it be protected or regulated? When given a choice, the government always goes for the option that expands its powers at the expense of the citizenry's. Moreover, when it comes to free speech activities, regulation is just another word for censorship. Right now, it's trendy and politically expedient to denounce, silence, shout down, and shame anyone whose views challenge the prevailing norms. So the tech giants are lining up to appease their shareholders. This is a tyranny of the majority against the minority. Exactly the menace to free speech that James Madison sought to prevent when he drafted the First Amendment to the Constitution, marching in lockstep with techno-fascism. With intolerance as the new scarlet letter of our day, we now find ourselves ruled by the mob. And I'll pause there. What do we always hear the mockingbird media, the politicians, the blowhards, the pundits, the think tanks always talk about? Our democracy. Our democracy. What is a democracy? Isn't that just 51% mob rule? Do we have a democracy? Or do we have a constitutional republic where the right of the individual is protected? Those who dare to voice an opinion or use a taboo word or image that runs counter to the accepted norms are first in line to be shamed, shouted down, silenced, censored, fired, cast out, and generally relegated to the dust heap of ignorant, mean-spirited bullies who are guilty of various word crimes and banished from society. For example, a professor at Duquesne University was fired for using the N-word in an academic context. To get his job back, Gary Schenck will have to go through diversity training and restructure his lesson plans. Get back in line, Gary. This is what passes for academic freedom in America today. If Americans don't vociferously defend the right of a minority of one to subscribe to let alone voice, ideas and opinions that may be offensive, hateful, intolerant, or merely different, then we're going to soon find that we have no rights whatsoever to speak, assemble, agree, disagree, protest, opt in, opt out, or forge our own paths as individuals. No matter what our numbers might be, no matter what our views might be, no matter what party we might belong to, it will not be long before we, the people, constitute a powerless minority in the eyes of a power-fueled fascist state driven to maintain its power at all costs. We are almost at that point now. The steady, pervasive censorship creep that is being inflicted on us by corporate tech giants, with the blessing of the powers that be, threatens to bring about a restructuring of reality straight out of Orwell's 1984, where the Ministry of Truth policies polices speech and ensures that facts conform to whatever version of reality the government propagandists embrace. Orwell intended 1984 as a warning. Instead, it is being used as a dystopian instruction manual for socially engineering a populace that is compliant, conformist, and obedient to Big Brother. Nothing good can come from techno-censorship. Again, to quote Greenwald, censorship power, like the tech giants who now wield it, is an instrument of status quo preservation. The promise of the internet from the start was that it would be a tool of liberation, of egalitarianism, by permitting those without money and power to compete on fair terms in the information war with the most powerful governments and corporations. But just as is true of allowing the internet to be converted into a tool of coercion and mass surveillance, nothing guts that promise, that potential, like empowering corporate overlords and unaccountable monopolists to regulate and suppress what can be heard. As I make clear in my book, Battlefield America, The War on the American People, these internet censors are not acting in our best interest to protect us from dangerous disinformation campaigns. They're laying the groundwork to preempt any dangerous ideas that might challenge the power's elite stranglehold over our lives. Therefore, it is important to recognize the thought prison that is being built around us for what it is. A prison with only one route of escape: free thinking and free speaking in the face of tyranny. And hence why we have to keep bouncing from platform to platform, and we will likely continue to do so until we the people have had enough. Get the hell off of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, every single one of them. Turn them into the dustbin of history. Build around and through them. And it's not going to just stop there, folks. We've seen this already laid out with Trump. Get blacklisted off those platforms. Get blacklisted off the banking system. We're going to have to build those too. We're going to have to build payment platforms. We're going to have to build a hell of a lot of things in very short order to get around this bullshit. I hope you recognize that. I hope you share this with folks on the outside who otherwise are not aware of what is going on. Hate to sound like a broken record, but it bears repeating repeatedly. And if that's not enough, as I mentioned in the previous article, we get this out of Strategic Culture Foundation. It says how conspiracy theorizing may soon get you labeled a domestic terrorist. Right? So 75 million folks who voted with wrongthink, right? We're the domestic terrorists. Are we a quiet minority, or are we the majority at this point? What do you think? Who are the real terrorists that go undefined? Do you think we necessarily have to wait for the DOJ, the FBI, any of these institutions in a failed government to tell us who the real domestic terrorists are? No, we don't. What you see with your very own eyes should be enough. And as Trump told us many a time before, who is the real enemy of the people? The mockingbird media. And did we not just see also the fact that we had CNN and NBC caught red-handed paying off somebody in the Capitol riots, Mr. John Sullivan? Oh, don't look here. No, look over there, folks. Nope, those are Trump supporters. They are the ones. How much you want to bet that Congress already has a Patriot Act 2.0 sitting there at the ready, drummed up by their K Street friends, ready to go, and multi-millions of dollars are ready to be shoveled in their pockets as soon as that legislation gets passed? Don't think for a second that isn't laying at the wait. So the article says, conspiracies for good and for evil do exist now, as they have from time immemorial. Matthew Arrett writes, the only question is, which intention do you want to devote your life towards? If you're starting to feel like forces controlling the governments of the West are out to get you, then it is likely that you are either a paranoid nut job or a stubborn realist. Either way, it means that you have some major problems on your hands. If you don't happen to find yourself among the tinfoil hat-wearing strata of conspiracy theorists waiting in a bunker for aliens to either strike down or save society from the shape-shifting lizard people, but are rather contemplating how, in the 1960s, a shadow government took control of society over the dead bodies of many assassinated patriots, then certain conclusions tend to arise. 3 elementary realizations for thinking people. And I sincerely hope that many of you in chat here this evening would consider yourselves part of that group of folks called the thinking people. Maybe a few tinfoil hat conspiracy nut jobs out there, but I digress. The first conclusion you would likely arrive at is the United States government was just put through the first coup in over 58 years. Yes, what happened in 1963 was a coup, although it is becoming a bit prohibitive to speak such words aloud in polite society. Pelosi's official biographer, Molly Ball, recently penned a scandalous Time magazine article entitled The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Elections, which admitted to this conspiracy, saying, even though it sounds like a paranoid fever dream, a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. Lest you think that this was a subversion or democracy, Ball informs us that they were not rigging the election, they were fortifying it. Another conclusion you might come to is that many of the political figures whom you believed were serving those who elected them into office actually serve the interests of a clique of technocrats and billionaires lusting over the deconstruction of Western civilization under something called a Great Reset. Where this was brushed off as an unfounded conspiracy theory not long ago, even Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and neo-Nazi supporting Rhodes Scholar, Chrystia Freeland, decided to become a trustee of the World Economic Forum just weeks ago. In this role, Freeland joins fellow Oxford technocrat Mark Carney in their mutual endeavor to be a part of the new movement to decarbonize civilization and make feudalism cool again. And for those who don't know who Mark Carney was, well, he used to be the head of the Central Bank of England up until about a year or so ago. Lastly, you might notice that your having arrived at these conclusions is itself increasingly becoming a form of thought crime punishable in a variety of distasteful ways, elaborated by a series of unprecedented new emergency regulations that propose extending the definition of terrorism. Those implicated under the new definition will be those broad swaths of citizens of Western nations who don't agree with the operating beliefs of the ruling oligarchy. Already, a 60-day review of the U.S. military is underway to purge the armed forces of all such thought criminals, while McCarthyite legislation has been crafted and drafted to cleanse all government's jobs of conspiracy theorists. Another startling announcement from the National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin that domestic terrorists include ideologically motivated violent extremists with objections to the exercise of governmental authority and perceived grievances fueled by false narratives. While not yet fully codified into law, though it will be, if not nipped in the bud soon, you can be sure that things are certainly moving fast as, before our very eyes, the right to free speech is being torn to shreds by means of censorship across social media and the internet, canceling all opinions deemed unacceptable to the ruling class. The conspiracy to subvert conspiracy theorizing. This should not come as a surprise, as Biden's new addition to the Department of Homeland Security is a bizarre figure named Cass Sunstein, who famously described exactly what this was going to look like in his infamous 2008 report, Conspiracy Theories, co-authored with Harvard Law School's Adrian Vermeule. In this underappreciated study, the duo foresaw the greatest threat to the ruling elite took the form of quote-unquote conspiracy theorizing within the American population, using as examples of this delusion the idea that the government had anything to do with the murders of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., or the planning and execution of 9/11. Just to be clear, conspiracy literally means two or more people acting together in accord with an agreed-upon idea and intention. The fact that Vermeule has made a legal career arguing that laws should be interpreted not by the intentions of lawgivers, but rather according to cost-benefit analysis, gives us a useful insight into the deranged mind of a technocrat and the delusional reasoning that denies the very thing which has shaped literally all of human history. In their scholarly, using air quotes behind the scenes here, essay, the authors wrote, "The existence of both domestic and foreign conspiracy theories, we suggest, is no trivial matter, posing real risks to the government's anti-terrorism policies, whatever the latter may be." After establishing his case for the threat of conspiracies, Sunstein says that the best response consists in cognitive infiltration of extremist groups. Not one to simply draw criticisms, the proactive Sunstein laid out 5 possible strategies which the social engineers managing the population could deploy to defuse the growing threat, saying, 1. Government might ban conspiracy theorizing. 2. Government might impose some kind of tax, financial or otherwise, on those who disseminate such theories. 3. Government might itself engage in counter-speech, marshaling arguments to discredit conspiracy theories. 4. Government might formally hire credible private parties to engage in counter-speech. 5. Government might engage in formal communication with such parties, encouraging them to help. Oh, I have to laugh. So funny. So, they're third parties, second parties, whatever. Isn't that our Twitters and Facebooks doing the government's bidding for them? And aren't the fact checkers the ones and that who are engaging in the counter speech, telling us correctly what the facts are? in their eyes. I'll let you think about which of these prescriptions were put into action over the ensuing 12 years. Cass Sunstein was particularly sensitive to this danger largely because, 1. He was a part of a very ugly conspiracy himself, and 2. He is a world-renowned behaviorist. Just conform, everybody, and everything will be fine. The problem of reality for behaviorists. As an economic behaviorist and lawyer arguing that all human rights should be extended to animals, blurring the line separating human dynamics from the law of the jungle, as any fascist must, Sunstein has spent decades trying to model human behavior with computer simulations in an effort to scientifically manage such behavior. Didn't we see how well that worked out with the pandemic stuff last year? Ridiculous. As outlined in his book Nudge, co-authored with Nobel Prize-winning behaviorist Richard Thaler, Sunstein discovered that people tend to organize their behavioral patterns around certain fundamental drives, such as the pursuit of pleasure, avoidance of pain, and certain Darwinian drives for sex, popularity, desire for conformity, desire for novelty, and greed. One of the key principles of economic behaviorism, which is seen repeated in such popular manuals as Freakonomics, Nudge, Predictably Irrational, The Wisdom of Crowds, and Animal Spirits, is that humans are both biologically determined due to their Darwinian impulses, but, unlike other animals, have the fatal flaw of being fundamentally irrational at their core. Since humans are fundamentally irrational, says the behaviorist, it is requisite that an enlightened elite impose order upon society, while maintaining the illusion of freedom of choice from below. This is the underlying assumption of Karl Popper's open society doctrine, which was fed to Popper's protege, Georgie Boy Soros, and which animates Soros's general theory of reflexivity and his Oxford-based Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET. This was at the heart of Obama's science czar John Holdren's call for world government in his 1977 Ecoscience, co-written with his mentor Paul Ehrlich, where the young misanthrope envisioned a future utopic world governed by a scientifically managed master class, saying, "Perhaps those agencies, combined with UNEP and the United Nations population agencies, might eventually be developed into a planetary regime sort of an international superagency for population, resources, and environment. Such a comprehensive planetary regime could control the development, administration, conservation, and distribution of all natural resources, renewable or non-renewable." Sounds an awful lot like Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030, right? And the Great Reset, of course, all blended into one nice little package. The caveat: if Darwinian impulses mixed with irrational animal spirits were truly all that animated those systems which behaviorists wish to map and manipulate, aka nudge with rewards and punishments, then a scientific priesthood would indeed be a viable and perhaps necessary way to organize the world. Fortunately, reality is a bit more elegant and dignified than behaviorists wish to admit. Why computer modelers hate metaphysics. On a closer inspection of history, we find countless instances where people shape their individual and group behavior around sets of ideas that transcend controllable material impulses. When this happens, those individuals or groups tend to resist adapting to environments created for them. This incredible phenomenon is witnessed empirically in the form of the American Revolution, Warsaw Ghetto uprisings, civil rights movements, and even some bold manifestations of anti-lockdown protests now underway around the world. Among the most troublesome of those variables, which upset computer models, are conscience, truth, intentions, soul, honor, God, justice, patriotism, dignity, and freedom. Whenever individuals shape their identities around these very real, though immaterial, aka metaphysical, principles, they cannot be nudged toward predetermined decisions that defy reason and morality. Adherence to these principles also tends to afford thinking people an important additional edge of creative insight necessary to cut through false explanatory narratives that attempt to hide lies behind the appearance of truth, aka sophistry. You know, like climate change, Mr. John Kerry. Please do enlighten us how a cold storm, like the polar vortex, heading down to places like Texas, is somehow spun on its head and is, contrary to belief, he tells us, that was global warming. You're just supposed to believe that, folks, because the climate czar, Mr. John Kerry, said so. While he flies around on his private planes. As witnessed on multiple occasions throughout history, such individuals who value the health of their souls over the intimidating and extremely malleable force of popular opinion will often decide to sacrifice personal comfort and even their lives in order to defend those values, which their minds and consciences deem important. These rare but invaluable outliers will often resist policies that threaten to undo their freedoms or undermine the basis of their society's capacity to produce food and energy for their children and grandchildren. What is worse is that their example is often extremely contagious, causing other members of the sheep class to believe that they, too, are human and endowed with unalienable rights which should be defended. Shocker. Isn't that why we enshrine them on a piece of paper known as our Bill of Rights? Not that they are something that can be wadded up, cast aside, spit on, shit on, or otherwise, that the government thinks that they have the ability to take away. No. They are inherent. They come by the hand of God. They cannot be taken in any way, shape, or form. I don't care how much you try to legislate. Congress. The intentions ordering world history. Perhaps most destructive of all is that these outlier people tend to look for abstract things like causes in historical dynamics, shaping the context of their present age, as well as their current geopolitical environment. Whenever this type of thinking is done, carefully crafted narratives, fed to the masses by an enlightened elite, will often fail in their powers to persuade, since seekers after truth soon come to realize that ideas and intentions, aka conspiracies, shape our past, present, and future. When the dominating intention shaping society's trajectory is in conformity with natural law, humanity tends to improve, freedoms increase, culture matures, and evil loses its hold. Inversely, when the intentions animating history are out of conformity with natural law, the opposite happens, as societies lose their moral and material fitness to survive and slip ever more quickly into dark ages. Dark ages? Or dark winter? While sitting in a jail in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. described this reality eloquently when he said, "A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. From Plato's organization of his academy and efforts to shape a philosopher king to beat the forces of the Persian Empire, to Cicero's efforts to save the Roman Republic, to Augustine's battles to save the soul of Christianity, all the way to our present age, conspiracies for the good and counter-conspiracies for evil have shaped history. If one were to begin an investigation into history without an understanding that ideas and intentions cause the trajectory of history, as is a standard practice among history professors dominant in today's world, then one would become incapable of understanding anything essential about one's own reality. It is irrelevant that behaviorists and other fascists wish their victims to believe that history just happens, simply because random short-sighted impulses kinetically drive events of a timeline. The truth of my claim exists for any serious truth seeker to discover it for themselves. Back to our present sad state of affairs. Now, we all know that Sunstein spent the following years working as Obama's regulatory czar alongside an army of fellow behaviorists who took control of all the levers of policy making, as outlined by Time magazine's April 13, 2009 article, How Obama is Using the Science of Change. As the fabric of Western civilization and traditional values of family, gender, and even macroeconomic concepts like development were degraded during this period, the military-industrial complex had a field day as Sunstein's wife, Samantha Power, worked closely with Susan Rice in the promotion of humanitarian bombings of small nations under Soros's responsibility to protect doctrine. What a cadre of nice folks that is. After the Great Reset agenda was announced in June 2020, Sunstein was recruited to head the propaganda wing of the World Health Organization, known as the WHO Technical Advisory Group, whereas skills in mass behavior modification was put to use in order to counteract the dangerous spread of conspiracy theories that persuaded large chunks of the world population that COVID-19 was part of a larger conspiracy to undermine national sovereignty and impose world government. The head of WHO described Sunstein's mandate in the following terms. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, countries are using a range of tools to influence behavior. Information campaigns are one tool, but so are laws, regulations, guidelines, and even fines. That's why behavioral science is so important. Think of that, folks. If you're in the UK, if you're in Australia, New Zealand, what is happening with your Keystone Cops? Are you not being fined for not following their rules at this point? That's a behavioral science thing right there, is it not? Get in line, conform, obey. Today, hundreds of Obama-era behaviorists have streamed back into influential positions of government under the new, scientifically managed, evidence-based governance coming back to life under Biden, promising to undo the dark days of President Trump. Orange man bad, right? Ideologues who have been on record calling for world government, the elimination of the sick and elderly, see Obama architect Ezekiel Emanuel's Why I Hope to Die at 75, and population control are streaming back into positions of influence. If you think that anything they have done to return to power is unlawful or antithetical to the principles of the Constitution, then these technocrats want you to know that you are a delusional conspiracy theorist, and as such represent a potential threat to yourself and the society of which you are but a part. If you question World Health Organization narratives on COVID-19 or doubt the use of vaccines produced by organizations like AstraZeneca due to their ties to eugenics organizations, then you are a delusional conspiracy theorist. If you doubt that global warming is caused by carbon dioxide, or that implementing the Paris Climate Accords may cause more damage to humanity than climate change ever could, then you must be a conspiracy theorist. If you believe that the US government just went through a regime change coordinated by something called the Deep State, then you run the risk of being labeled a delusional threat to the general welfare, deserving of the sort of treatment doled out to any typical terrorist. It appears that many comforts we have taken for granted over the past 50-year drunken stupor called globalization are quickly coming to an end. And thankfully, not one, but two opposing intentions for what the new operating system will be are actively vying for control. This clash was witnessed in stark terms during the January 2021 Davos Summit, where Xi Jinping and Putin's call for a new system of win-win cooperation, multipolarity, and long-term development offset the unipolar zero-sum ideologues of the West seeking to undo the foundations of industrial civilization. Either way you look at it, conspiracies for good and for evil do exist now, as they have from time immemorial. The only question is, which intention do you want to devote your life towards? Good read. I think Strategic Culture nailed it on the head yet again. Matthew Urett, good job on that one. So yes, which side will you serve? Will you join the lucky ranks of 75 million here in these United States? That's probably a lowball estimate. How many people probably didn't vote in this cycle that probably have similar ideas? Are we in the minority? Would the media have us believe we are the minority or the majority? And how many people worldwide do you think also ascribe to that? Do you think other governments around the world are not going to impose similar measures? It's already being planned. It's already being done. What's going on in the Netherlands right now? Why are they under lockdowns, having curfews and that, much to the same degree they used to after World War II? People are waking up. They're seeing through the bullshit. They've had enough. All right. Last but not least on the night, another interesting piece to round things out here. A question for leftists. Why are all the evil people on your side? Question brought to us by Brandon Smith over at Alt Market. The media these days is saturated with tales of evil conservatives and our heinous plans for world domination through insurrection. In fact, most mainstream articles that cover recent events, including the election and the protests at the Capitol, make a point to always mention white supremacy and terrorism in the same breath as the word conservative. This is an entirely deliberate propaganda tactic called word association, or word redefinition. Change the subtext of a word or group label in the minds of the masses, and you can often change perception from positive to negative. How many of you are cognizant of their technique there? Yes, word association. Don't fall for their BS. In other words, conservative equals racist/terrorist. It doesn't matter if it's not true. It just matters that people are conditioned to subconsciously make the connection. How about an example? I've offered numerous criticisms of Trump and his administration over the years, but none of those criticisms had anything to do with what leftists have been regurgitating since 2016. To them, Trump's racism was verified fact. Yet, when I ask any social justice warrior to produce an actual quote of Trump saying something racist, they can't seem to dig anything up. By extension, leftists have a bizarre obsession with Russia, and the theory that Russia is an ever-present hand of God in U.S. politics. Yet, none of them can produce any concrete proof that Russia has meaningful influence in American elections or affairs. The political left has committed itself to a fantasy world, a parallel universe. They deeply believe in things that never happened and treat those beliefs as sacrosanct. Why? Probably because their movement is infected with people that are easily manipulated by word redefinitions and false associations. Are they victims of propaganda? Sure. Are they innocent? No, not really. Refusal to question the actions and motives of your chosen movement is willful ignorance, and leftists should be held accountable for that. They are the only group of people that has consistently supported mass surveillance, mass censorship, and deplatforming, mass violence, property destruction, and looting, as well as violations of individual rights through medical mandates and lockdowns. They call conservatives insurrectionists and traitors, but they are the only people openly trying to dismantle constitutional protections and the Bill of Rights. So, who are the real villains of this story? Leftists seem to suffer from bewilderment when faced with conservative values. So, perhaps an explanation is needed. Think of it this way. Conservatives value core principles, natural law, and the vital fundamentals of civilization. We believe merit is more important than equity. We believe in winning through hard work and excellence, not winning by deception or through claims of victim status. We do not value personal feelings above logic and reason, and the opinion of a mob is no more important to us than the opinion of a single person. Conservatives don't owe any allegiance to the left's twisted vision of democracy, tyranny by the majority, nor do we hold blind allegiance to any particular government. Our allegiance is to the Bill of Rights and to the principles which founded this nation. And when a political group attempts to violate those principles, we are not required to submit simply because they collected more votes. Our rights are more important than any election. Our rights are more important than your fears. One of the core characteristics of conservatives is that we have a tendency to argue with each other. A lot. It's one of the main reasons why we find it difficult to organize on the same scale that leftists often do. We might all agree on the source of the problems our country faces, but we rarely agree on the details or the solutions. This is a weakness, but it is also a strength. I would much rather be part of a movement that self-reflects. I would much rather be a part of a movement that doesn't operate as a hive mind. There needs to be logical dissenting voices in everything so that ideas are challenged. If the ideas are found wanting by reason and wisdom, then they need to be addressed or abandoned. The political left has no concept of this, though. Leftists are afraid to question anything within their own circles. To dissent on the smallest detail is to be a heretic, a traitor to the cause. They use the word diversity all the time, like a battle cry. But when confronted with true diversity of thought, they panic and react violently. Leftists don't actually care about diversity. They only care that you have blind allegiance to the collective. Stray but a little, and the mob will come for your head. They love plantations. They love slavery, as long as they own the plantations and they control the slaves. A natural consequence of this animal farm mentality is that irony and hypocrisy is lost on the followers of such movements. They project all their shortcomings and crimes on others. The devils they see in conservatives are actually the devils they see in the mirror every day. That said, the higher up you get in the leftist pyramid, the less it becomes hypocritical and the more it becomes malicious and deliberate. The gaslighting, the word association propaganda, the selective memory hole they use to erase historical facts that contradict their ideology. The people at the top and their lackeys know exactly what they are doing. They don't care that their claims are hypocritical or outright fraudulent. They know they are lying. They know they are gaslighting. They are not interested in being right. They are only interested in winning. There is much more going on here than meets the eye. There is a great deal of power and money behind the rise of the hard left ideology, and there are certain people that benefit from its expansion. Leftists like to view themselves as the underdogs or revolutionaries fighting against the man. However, every resource of global power brokers has been offered in support of the political left. The man is the ally of the leftists. In some ways, he is even the creator of the leftist movement. They aren't revolutionaries at all. They are the jackboots of the New World Order. It was globalist institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation that funded different elements of the feminist movement and gender studies movements from the 1960s onward. This included the Rockefeller Foundation's large donations to the feminist press and the Ford Foundation's programs to indoctrinate university professors into injecting social justice talking points into their curriculum. This is openly admitted in Alison R. Bernstein's book, Funding the Future: Philanthropy's Influence on America's Higher Education. Bernstein is the Vice President of Education at the Ford Foundation and the former Associate Dean of Faculty at Princeton. That's right, folks. Social justice activism was paid for and encouraged by the so-called patriarchy. This is reality, and it never stopped. Even today, SJW groups are funded by globalists. For example, as the mainstream media often tries to dismiss or ignore, Black Lives Matter was initially funded by the Ford Foundation and George Soros and his Open Society Foundation. BLM coffers were flooded with over $100 million from uber-rich white elites. Again, this is a fact that even the dishonest spin doctors at Snopes are not able to deny. Instead, they attempt to use straw man arguments and sophistry to distract from the implication of extreme left mobs receiving seed money from elitist billionaires. But let's follow this path even further. Who gets the support of the mainstream media behemoths? Conservatives or leftists? The answer is obvious. What about big tech platforms? Do they enforce leftist ideological standards? Do they censor conservative viewpoints predominantly or leftist viewpoints predominantly? The reality is, the conservatives are deplatformed from Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook far more than leftists. This is verifiable fact. When alternative platforms like Parler are built, are they allowed to simply exist? Of course not. The leftists rampage in an effort to destroy them, but the leftists would have no power without the backing of corporate monopolies like Apple, Google, and Amazon. Not only does big tech aid the leftists in their jihad against conservatives, but the government does as well. They don't just go after alternative platforms, they try to go after web service providers. And when alternative platforms move to more freedom-oriented service providers like Epic, the leftists get government support in order to intimidate them also. Epic, by the way, is one of the web providers that Gab uses and had to endure over the course of the last 2 years. And I believe Telegram perhaps is also using Epic, for those who don't know. Leftists revel in the argument that freedom of speech does not mean freedom from consequences. They seem to think it is rather clever. I would say, actually, yes, that's exactly what freedom of speech means. Freedom of speech means that no single group of people is allowed to use fear, intimidation, and punishment to compel silence in other groups or individuals that disagree with them. With corporate monopoly and government on their side, it is clear that leftists have appointed themselves the sole arbiters of consequence. And this violates the Constitution in every conceivable way. The collusion between government, corporations, and extremist ideological movements is the classical definition of fascism. And just as the Third Reich enjoyed immense funding, investment, and industrial support from globalists and corporations in the decade leading up to World War II, the political left is enjoying immense support from the global corporate oligarchy today. You cannot be anti-fascist while you are colluding with fascists. So, again, I ask leftists, if you are the rebels, if you are the freedom fighters, then why are all the elites you are supposedly fighting against on your side? Why are evil people your most avid allies? Very, very good question, right? How would these folks like BLM and Antifa survive if they didn't have the backing of Uber donors and foundations? So again, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the powers, the principalities, and the rulers of the darkness of this age. Who are those principalities and powers? The people pulling the strings behind the scenes? I think we have some of those answers right there, do we not? So who should we direct our attention to mostly? The people on the streets? No. They're just in the way. They're the ends to a means to an end. Where should we direct our attention to? Removal of the institutions, the Ford Foundations, the open societies. Bring them to their knees. And at the end of the day, you take away their funding, they're left with nothing. And what better way to do that than to strike it at the very heart? Wipe out the Federal Reserve, wipe out their fiat currency known as the US dollar, return to a gold standard. Poof, gone in an instant. Gone in an instant. Could happen tomorrow. All right. What say you guys here this evening? Some interesting reads. Let's see. No more people trafficking, smuggling. Commies are against freedom. Of course they are. They like to be controlled. They like to be part of the herd mentality, don't they? This is why we say people are asleep, because they might as well be, for all they notice what's right in front of them. Yep. It's right in front of us, folks. Open your eyes. Fools fooling more fools. Yeah. Neuro-linguistic programming. Yep. Let's see here. Yeah, we don't conform. Yep, this is where we're at. Let's see. I don't believe I've talked about dumbs in the past. We have had folks on the channel bring that up, but I typically don't go down that path over on D-Live. Now, granted, there's something to be said when every single earthquake happens at 10 kilometers down. If you go out to the old USGS site, that might be a little surprising to most. How is it possible that all these earthquakes can possibly happen at the same depth, with the exception of the 7.1 or 7.3 we just had in Japan here recently? What did Putin just do with regard to the US dollar? I don't know at this point, although I will say that China and Russia over the years have definitely been loading up on gold. Perhaps some of you guys may recall a plane dumping half its payload out the backside here, was a couple, 2-3 years ago now, hauling some gold. As we know, gold destroys the Fed. It destroys all central banks. There's a reason why many central banks around the world, the Germanys and whatnot, have been recalling their gold deposits back from the Federal Reserve in New York. Even Texas, in recent years, 3, 4, 5 years ago now, wanted their gold back. Why? Because they themselves are a republic. I find it very interesting at this point that Texas is being hit with what they are being hit with. If you look at this in the context of, you know, Paxton going against Biden in terms of immigration, in terms of Second Amendment, even the fact that Texas was the first to stand up and challenge the election and put things in front of the Supreme Court. So is this retaliation at the end of the day? Perhaps one might look at it that way, I don't know. But nonetheless, yeah, who said when fascism comes to America, it will come in the guise of anti-fascism? Yeah, I recall. I don't remember exactly who said that, but... Yep. Yeah, if you're in Texas, it'll be hard hit with hurricanes this year. Yeah. One cannot overlook the engineering of our weather. Look who's been in the news a lot here as of late. Mr. Bill Gates. He's everywhere, isn't he? Everywhere you want him to be. He's got his hands in everything, doesn't he? Including aerosol injection spraying. As if Forbes, in recent days, maybe dating myself back toward the beginning of the month, seemed to suggest this is a novel idea. As if this is something just thought up. As if those of us who have eyes to see cannot clearly see that aerosols are actually being injected into the atmosphere for a phenomenon known as global dimming. Who knew? Like this is some novel idea just thought up by Billy Boy. No, he's been funding this for quite some time. Please. Forbes, you're dead. Dead to the world. Your institution is dead. Your periodicals, your articles, just like everything else Mockingbird Media related. Finito. Alright. Well, I think that'll do it for tonight's rendition here. Been going on here for a little bit, so appreciate you guys tuning in as always. And tomorrow, here on the 5x5 network, we will be back with our roundtable at our normal time. 3 p.m., 4 p.m. I should say, Eastern. Hopefully we'll have our folks net from across the pond join, Daddy Dragon. Sunny Days, if she's still out there. I think I saw her floating through a little bit ago. In the meantime, I may be back. Not sure if I'll do that on my channel, which I dropped the link out there. If you're not subscribed to my channels, get out there and do that. Otherwise, I may do it through my No BS show here. May talk a little bit about what's going on in Texas and the ensuing fallout, as I've been talking about that for the better part of the last week. So, stay tuned in that regard. Appreciate you guys tuning in as always, and we'll be back here real soon. Take care. God bless everybody.